I've always thought that was impossible, but
now you're going to see it. Okay. Welcome back. I think, yep, we're up and running. This same vaguely cast of people. It's my great pleasure to kick us off for the second session. This session is same length, but although we have three people speaking in a slightly different configuration. So after a quick confab, Tarek Bakawi of the LSE is going to deliver George's paper.
Just to really mess with subjectivity.
Yeah, so Tarek will speak first, then Rosenborn of Queen's College, Cambridge will speak, and George will have manfully stepped up to comment. So we have at the same time slightly fewer people speaking in the initial run. So it's all fairly relaxed. Same rules of engagement. Everybody's part of the workshop. Anybody can chip in, perhaps not when the speakers are actually speaking. But after that, and we'll just see where it goes. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Leeds Tarek Bakawi from the LSE. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Peter, very much for having us. This paper is sort of a thought piece that George and I put together for a special issue of the Journal of Political Power and Social Theory. Is that right?
That's right.
And we're going to turn it into an article or something along the way. So it's very much at a kind of nascent stage, and I'm not going to take a full 20 minutes. I just kind of want to give you the big sort of main ideas at work in this. And for me, one other preliminary comment. George was playing on being Mr. IR earlier. Neither George or I are normal IR people. And I certainly spend a lot of time in archives and don't sort of position myself in a sort of IR theory kind of a way. So I just kind of throw that out there, that there's a lot of space between disciplines that it can be fun to occupy. And that's certainly where George and I are in different ways. So I think the route into the topic of the international origins of social and political theory, my favorite route into this is to begin with the contemporary, or maybe with the Cold War university, and think about how it is that in the university there are self-conscious communities of social scientists and humanities people who constitute themselves distinctly as the producers of theory. And they draw very sharp boundaries between themselves and those they study, their objects of study, who in my field sometimes get called practitioners, not practitioners as historians, but practitioners as soldiers, diplomats, businessmen, people of this kind, business people of this kind. Meanwhile, the practitioners in the contemporary world also constitute themselves in relation to the question of theory, but now as against. What we do is reality. You know, we are close to the ground. We are not into the airy-fairy stuff that goes on in ivory towers where people theorize and use 50-cent words and can't be read. And so you create these two self-conscious communities of theorists and practitioners who are very into boundary maintenance in various kinds of ways. And then you get a class of transboundary people who cross over. They're the policy-relevant academics. And the idea of the policy-relevant academic is you dumb down theory to the level of where it might be digestible by a practitioner. And you don't bore them with too much theory. You get right to something that might be usable knowledge. Now it seems to me that that situation, which of course I've described in a very ideal, typical, and kind of conflictual kind of a way, if we reflect on that for only a moment and think where it is that the great theoretic systems that we employ in our work, the concepts that we use to make sense of our inquiry, that we launch our inquiries on, where they come from. And the cast of characters who were both progenitors of theoretic systems, but also practitioners, is quite large. I mean, one need only think of what the administrative offices of the East India Company have done, for political theoretic scholarship, for, legal theory and so on. Where does these guys come from? My favorite character in this, George's favorite character is Karl Marx. Mine is Karl von Clausewitz, who, because he occupies a subaltern position, right, ancien regime Prussia vis-a-vis modernizing and revolutionary France, is able to come up with a set of concepts, ways of thinking about war, theoretic and philosophic categories that have stood the test of time, have been developed in all kinds of interesting and different directions. We could use a few more soldiers like Clausewitz who think so creatively, but nonetheless, Clausewitz himself, to call him either a theorist or a practitioner and not do violence to what he was up to would be a huge mistake. So, point number one is that the divide between theory and practice needs to be profoundly rethought, and practitioners seen as people who have developed concepts, conceptual systems, theoretic systems, and so on. And these theoretic systems don't just go into the university to be used by scholars, they return to practice. So who is read in every staff college in the world is Karl von Clausewitz, whose concepts are invoked in every discussion staff officers have about, how to invade or wherever they're invading, or what is their operational concept for something. They refer back to that text. They develop that text. They write new writings, as Clausewitz, passé. He's for old wars. We need a new way of thinking about new wars or whatnot, right? In the paper, we use the example of the way in which Marxian theory keeps returning as Marxists and revolutionaries develop and adapt it to their situation and add new sets of concepts, new sub-theories, and so on, which of course become the stuff of things that academic Marxists spend a lot of time thinking about and digesting. So practitioners are theorists, and if we want to understand the origins of theoretic categories, we have to see them in the course of historical practice. That's the first kind of big point that we make. The second point is implicit in this sort of setup. That one of the things that really sort of focuses the minds of practitioners, again I'll come back to my Clausewitz example, is the transboundary encounter. When you run into other social, political, and cultural formations, when they interact with you, when they conquer you, or things happen and you read about them and you imagine it happening in your society, these things are generative. These transboundary encounters are generative of these moments out of which conceptual systems and theories are developed. Here my favorite example to deploy is not a direct transboundary encounter, but someone looking and reading about one. This is the scholarship now on Hegel and Haiti, and on how Hegel was following closely what was happening in Haiti, and he was thinking through what is often seen as a philosophic system that is somehow rooted in classical Greek categories, was in fact a historical happening before his eyes. And that historical happening before his eyes, which is a profoundly transborder encounter, an imperial encounter, a slave and free encounter, all kinds of things going on in Haiti, is generative of something we now take to be a purely philosophic system. And we read it purely philosophically until someone comes along and figures out that actually Haiti, or actually Hegel was paying attention to what was happening in the world around him, and that informed his theorizing profoundly. So, theory practice, where practice becomes a site of theoretic generation and conceptual development, and the transboundary encounter as historic moments which generate this theory practice stuff in really profound and diverse ways. Now, there are various ways in which we can go with this, and we welcome kinds of suggestions and what you make of this. I think we were a little disappointed with what the contributors to our special issues made of it. So we're really going to I'm sort of curious to say. And the one kind of question I'll sort of leave you with about this is how would you help me and George characterize the difference between intellectual history on the one hand and the kind of program I've suggested on the other, where in order to understand where these ideas and conceptual systems come from, you have to pay attention to the historical situatedness of actors in situations which require them to act, right, as practitioners, and as moments of transboundary encounter that generate theoretic systems. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Oh. Cumbria, you know. We'll move directly to Orr, and then we will circle back via George.
Great, thanks. So the title of my paper is slightly changed from the one you have in your program. So now it is called The Political Spaces of the History of International Thought. And I think it resonates really well with what we've just heard now. This, just to give you a bit of background, this is a sort of a spin-off project from my book, which should be published in March, in which I look at interpretations of globalism and world order in the 1940s and in Britain and the US. So what I'm trying to do in this more methodological project is to think about methodologies for really investigating the history of international thought. And I use international thought, but we could also apply that to transnational thought or global thought. I'm trying to investigate the differences between these modes of thinking about intellectual history, and also about the relations between this kind of intellectual history and IR as a field of study. So what I'm presenting here today is part of a chapter for a book that looks at IR historiography. And in this kind of bigger chapter, I propose new methodologies for studying the historiography of IR. But I'm not going to do this today because I think that disciplinary history is slightly restrictive as a field of study, especially in the past few years. I'm going to do something slightly different, which is to investigate the ideas of an Italian historian and political thinker, Carlo Galli, and especially his notion of political space, and to think how this idea can help us generate new research in the history of international thought. So I start by inquiring what is the meaning of political space. So I look back to Galli's writings, and he suggests it's the interplay between theoretical ideas and geographical reality. Political space entails, and I quote, the perception of the physical geographic conditions of the world and their impact on the political and social order. It is the implicit spatial representations in and through which political thought supports itself. That is to say that political theories form their concepts, arrange their actors, organize their actions, and devise the aims of politics in terms of collaboration and conflict, order and disorder, hierarchy and equality, inclusion and exclusion, borders and freedom, sedentariness and nomadism, marginality and centrality. So I found these initial reflections of Galli on the notion of political space very stimulating in my own work. But I wanted to take his conception, which is very much influenced by, let's say, Carl Schmitt and his categories of the political, and to see what kind of categories can emerge from it. Could we take it in directions that are not inherently Schmittian? And I think we can. So what I try to do in my own research is to look at how past thinkers understood the speciality of their field of study. So first of all, in a more plain geographical manner. For example, I looked at the IR scholar and sinologist Owen Lattimore, who employed spatial concepts in the 1940s to reflect on the pluralism that characterized and empowered nomadic societies. He proposed the hybrid structure of Central Asian societies and imagined the great frontier that crossed Asia from Korea to Turkey as a model for stateless order, anticipating and inspiring the political thought of contemporary thinkers like James C. Scott on a global level, if you want. So what Lattimore tried to do is to think about the concrete experience of space that these societies had lived through, and to extrapolate from this experience the political categories that could define the sort of social and political order that they constructed. And so Lattimore's political thought, or IR thought, is very much dependent on his understanding of these geographical conditions. So in the context of the interpretative perspective of political space, I think that the history of international thought can make use of a more specific concept, the boundary, which I found useful in Lattimore's thought, but then I started thinking about it and trying to export this idea of the boundary to different regions of thought in the history of international theory. So in this article, in this paper, I examined various examples of the way the boundary can help us rethink the field of international thought, or if you want, political thought beyond the state in its various ramifications. I think, first of all, the notion of the boundary can be particularly helpful in thinking about the meaning of the international and its interaction with other spatial terms like the global, the regional, local, transnational, national. I think that all of these terms need to be defined and redefined according to concrete and say specific historical moments that the notion of the boundary can help us understand. For example, if I look at international thought in the 1940s, the idea of the region was conceptualized along various kinds of boundaries. For example, Clarence Strait proposed the idea of creating a region of democracies that was, in what we'd say today, transnational, and united various geographic units along constitutional lines, claiming that all the democracies should form a unity, a federal union. Others, like Barbara Wooten and Lionel Robbins, drew regional boundaries along geographic lines, but highlighted the importance of economic unity in fostering a geographic union. So for them, the boundary was formed by the kind of economic system that could be implemented in a geographic space. Lionel Curtis, on the other hand, envisaged federal order based on the experience of empire, and he drew the boundaries along Christian civilizational lines. So I suggest that the exploration of the various boundaries of the regions that they proposed, which were all to be regional federations, help us understand not only the cartographic images that they had in mind, but also the political categories that really pushed forward their thinking about politics beyond the state. The notion of political space can also become a reading key, an instrument in the hand of the historian to investigate the boundaries of the discipline. So boundary drawing is, I suggest, a political act, and setting the limits of the discipline is therefore not a neutral decision. So what should be included and excluded from the history of international thought? How does it differentiate itself from international history or from historical IR? Are there different subject matters, methods, research tools, and what could be the common ones? What has been borrowed from other disciplines into the study of the international? So the boundary can be seen as a zone of tension and division, or as a zone of exchange and interaction, a fertile area of shared knowledge. I suggest that the notion of the boundary can also help us rethink the canon of protagonists in international thought in a way. For example, in a volume that presents 50 key thinkers in international thought, only four women are listed, 3 of which are in the category of IR and gender. So we can think about the boundary of exclusion of women from international thought, both contemporary and historical. However, these boundaries should be, in a way, challenged and questioned. For example, when the economist Barbara Wooten wanted to participate in a conference on international economics organized by the League in Geneva, she was excluded because the British delegation would not accept women, but had to be admitted through the back door, through personal connections that she had at the League. So the boundaries of institutional inclusion play an important role in this case to understand the place of women in the historiography, and also possibly their place as practitioners, if you want, in the field now. On the same pattern, we can think about the boundaries of the discipline to reflect on other social marginalized groups. For example, Robert Vitalis has recently explored the writings of Black American IR scholars, and his book shows that a whole story has been completely omitted from the IR historiography so far. So we should perhaps use the boundary not only to reflect on the limits of past conceptions of IR, but also on the fact that today this kind of scholarship is still considered kind of boundary breaking. I discuss also in the paper that I invite you to read the boundaries of the production sites of international thought. So international historians have helped to understand the importance of specific geographic sites of knowledge production about the international, such as the League of Nations or international conferences. So obviously these were not only institutional sites of power and interaction, but actual geographic locations where people met and interacted, and Susan Pedersen's book reflects that very well. But I think that thinking about the boundaries of these institutions in both geographical and kind of more conceptual terms can help us think about the meaning of the international and its more local ramifications. Finally, I've been thinking a lot recently about the disciplinary history of IR, and a lot of historians recently have shown that there is a great discrepancy between international relations theory in the United States and Britain, where the academic disciplines were much more powerful than elsewhere, and the development of these disciplines in other even European realities like Italy, France, and Norway, where international thought has been developed in separately from the English language discipline. But the result of this separation, the linguistic boundaries between various hubs of research in international relations, led to a sense of marginalization, which can still be seen in some countries like in Italy, where I'm a bit more familiar with. So the lack of common language has been a problem for the development of scholarship in IR as an academic field. However, other examples like the Institute of Pacific Relations gives us a good insights about the possibilities of interaction between various national realities around a geographical zone. So various research councils in countries that did not share a common language, including the United States, Britain, China, Japan, and Russia, that had specific common interest in the regional reality of the Pacific, have created a common organization to exchange these views on international relations. So I think that these exploring these kind of institutions can tell us a lot about the actual political spaces of the development of international thought, and also the patterns of power that dominated them. Because, for example, if I go back to the IPR, the predominance of the American groups there that has been revealed in archival research shows that even this kind of apparently transnational and horizontally organized institution is not really characterized by equal and accommodating patterns of interaction. So finally, the notion of the boundary, I think, helps us also to reflect on the power relations that have played along in the formation of international thought. We've talked a bit before in the previous panel on the importance of empire in thinking internationally, and the bias, the Eurocentric bias of international thinkers has also been the target of contemporary scholars. But I think that there is much more to explore in the realm of the interaction between imperial history and the history of international thought. It is not It is not so straightforward as has been suggested. It's not really only about mere Eurocentric bias, because it's, I think it is much more of a story of encounters and dialogues through various kinds of institutional networks that can help us rethink the origins of certain concepts in international thought. So really, to sum up, I'm interested in the notion of political space as an interpretative key to rethink the history of international thought, its protagonists, its subject matters, its geographical dimensions and defining categories. I think this concept of political space can help ground abstract theory in more concrete and contingent relations. And it also helps to reflect on the need to define the international and to reflect on the idea that the mere concept of the international is not a stable one. It's one that changes according to various geographical and temporal conditions. The boundary, I suggest, seeks to challenge the interaction of the history of international thought and other fields of study, and to find common narratives about the international that cross interdisciplinary divides. So I think that the national, in this concept, the boundary helps us to understand that the national is still relevant, but should be studied along other political spaces with which it overlaps. So there is, I think, a need for a more complicated and nuanced understanding of the various spaces of interaction that make the international, but are not limited to it. So I'll stop that.
Very much. Well, my own notes were kind of spider diagram questions. Thankfully, George is going to sort all that out
No
now.
problem.
There's lots of questions.
Some. Thanks very much. And as Peter said, it's quite odd commenting on your own paper. I've never done it before. It's quite difficult, in one sense, to think about, at least consciously and explicitly, objectifying my own subjectivity. I'm sure I've done it implicitly a lot, but I don't think I've quite confronted it in this explicit way. But it's also quite easy because, of course, our paper is perfect and yours is nearly perfect, so I don't have that much to say about all of them. But I think
Let's just have coffee then.
that's fine with me. So I'll say a couple of things about our paper and a couple of things about ours, and then see if I can draw out just one or two questions that link them, however tenuously. So in terms of our paper, a kind of semi-auto-critique, as Tarek said, it was the context for it. It was a thought piece written for a particular purpose, for a particular workshop, for a particular special issue, and so it was deliberately introductory and provocative and big picture. But our question, which is what Tarek started with, is it turnable into something, and if so, what is it? And we would like your thoughts and your help on that. Are we onto something? It seems to me that we are. Maybe it's something a bit more obvious than we thought. I just was one of the examiners for a very, very good PhD written in the IR department at LSE that talks about the concept of balance of power and how balance of power shifted from being a practice that was mobilised for political purposes to becoming an abstract theoretical system. And it traces that very nicely over a couple of centuries. Morton Anderson's. It's great, and the second you read it, you think, of course. So are we saying something actually quite obvious, or are we saying something that other people have thought already, or are we onto something? And if we are onto something, what is it? Two questions in that regard that I think we have for ourselves. The first is that we are conceiving in the hard version of our argument, we are thinking about history, theory, practice as effectively a single field, that we are trying to not distinguish between those particular concepts and those particular categories. But is that going too far? Is there some kind of actually relative autonomy between these particular ideas, these particular notions, these particular practices? And if we were to dissemble them, would they look differently in terms of their relationships? Is history theory a different type of relationship to history practice, to theory practice? So the combination of the three, history, theory, practice, is our contention in its hardest possible form. But is there actually something to be gained from a relative autonomy between them, or dissembling them and specifying the relationship between them? Is there some kind of causal direction or some type of specific relationship between them that we haven't yet got to? And if so, what is it? The second question for ourselves is our story one that's common to social and political theory in general, or are we telling a more specific international theory story than we think? Again, in our hardest possible iteration of our argument, we're trying to say that transboundary encounters are specifically constitutive of particular type of theories and ideas and categories and concepts, even when we don't think of them as international or transnational theories and ideas. So we're trying to make that the moment of conception here. But is that right, and is that true across the board when it comes to social and political theory, or is there some specific international dimension here that we're either exaggerating or missing? So those are the only things I really have to say about our paper, because that's really where we've got to in terms of our own thinking about this, and we'd like to turn back to it, but we'd like some help from you, please, in terms of thinking, are we onto something, and if so, what is it? In terms of Orr's paper, I mean, there's a huge amount here, as you just heard, and I recommend people to read it. It's extremely interesting and intriguing, but it's also because it's the beginning of something suggestive and promissory rather than specified. And I guess my questions for you is, which directions are you going to go in? I was struck that the things you're wrestling with are huge. You know, you're wrestling with theory, concepts, categories, representation, space, politics, geopolitics, geography, temporality. Not bad in 8 pages to have made the sense that you did, right? But these are huge things. And if I just, the quote from Galley on page 2 is interesting here. It talks about the implicit spatial representations in and through which political thought supports itself. That is to say that political theories form their concepts, arrange their actors, organise their actions, and devise the aims of politics in terms of collaboration and conflict, order and disorder, hierarchy and equality, inclusion and exclusion, borders and freedom, sedentariness and nomadism, and marginality and centrality. I think that's everything. Yeah. And of course we can't do everything. So what is it that you think this particularly opens up that we might have been missing? I think your argument, there were 2 or 3 different lines, but I thought your main point that you wanted to get at, which strikes me as extremely interesting, is that spatial interpretations produce categories of thought that produce projects of international and political order making. That strikes me as very interesting, and I like it a lot, but you chucked in at least 2 other strands, and I want to know whether you want to follow them or not, that would also be interesting but aren't as clear for me as that line of thinking. One is whether you actually do think geography matters here, because geography isn't in materiality, as in the physicality of geography, isn't in necessarily a spatial representation. If you think that you can represent any space any way, I mean, I don't think you can. It strikes me as geography is super important, and associated technological practices. You're not going to come up with a particular political imaginary until you can circumvent the globe. Until you can explore the African interior, you're not going to come up with a particular form of international order making. So it strikes me that geography is important, but I couldn't tell how it was. If you're starting in what seemed to be the Galli-Foucault format of thinking about representation as your starting point rather than physicality and materiality. At least I couldn't quite work out the line of reasoning there. Similarly, you have a sentence which you may not mean, but I really like, about epochal change as being fundamental and constitutive of international order making. I agree. I don't agree that the 19th century is such a different world in that regard. I mean, that's where we first thought about how to be modern, and how concepts of capitalism and concepts that we're still around with today, and the particular type of incessant technological change that we think about as constitutive of modern projects of international order making. But it's a different claim. Thinking about temporality as somehow being constitutive as a shift isn't starting with spatial representations, it's starting with something actually material happening that then forms particular projects or imaginaries of international order making. So I'm just trying to tease out for you, what is your direction of thought? What ties these things together? These are huge and fascinating and intriguing themes, but what is it you want to run with, and what maybe do you have to leave behind? The classic question is, what is it not? What is the project not about? What's the stuff not going to be dealing with? You've got Galli's litany of it's everything, but if we agree that it can't be everything, what is it, but also what is it not? Similar type of thought about the use of the word boundary, which I agree with you is fascinating and potentially hugely important. But there are different types of boundary going on in what you talk about, and I wonder whether they're the same thing. I was struck that actually some of the examples that you get to are actually very conventional. You know, we have this move to boundaries that's going to open up all this thing, and then we're talking about Robbins and Mitrani, right? Or we're talking about national traditions of thought and how we might compare them. I mean, that's taking boundaries very seriously. They're there in a substantialist sense. They physically operate. They're symbolically important. Let's disrupt them. Very like, let's do the politics of enlargement through national archives, and let's then think about whether transnational disrupts that. That's quite a conventional way of getting at those particular types of boundary or transboundary type of movements. But there are at least a couple of different ways one could conceptualize this. One is to think, as you did, with traditions of thought, but not necessarily the kind of contrapuntal histories you're talking about, but realism is a transnational idea. I mean, I'm quite taken with the Hedley Bull idea that the American version of realism is a crib to the European realpolitik tradition, then given a kind of American sort of pseudo-positivist twist. At least we can follow through Morgenthau and other lineages, Weber, Nietzsche, particular traditions of political realism and Machiavelli, and how that gets produced transnationally in some type of transnational framework rather than a comparative national framework. So we can do that with all sorts of traditions of thought in really interesting ways. But that didn't seem to be the same thing as talking about the type of comparative of national traditions of thought that you use as some of your examples. And that's not the same thing at all, it strikes me, as talking about gender, which is not always formalised and institutionalised. Sometimes you're right, it is, but a lot of the time it's informal. It's about implicit bias, or it's about tacit practices. It's about stuff that are actually very different types of boundaries of thought and boundaries of practice, but not necessarily formalised institutional boundaries or legal boundaries. There's something else going on in the use of the term boundary there that it might be worth clarifying. So what kinds of boundary are you interested in? And I guess in terms of thinking about links to the first panel this morning, what is a transnational boundary? Transnational in many ways, it is very good again at talking about networks and flows, power laden, all the rest of it, but not so good about thinking about boundaries. So what is the outside of a transnational network or a transnational flow of some kind? How do we think about boundaries in that respect if we don't just think about them as the excess of the national, but actually think of them as constitutive of the national in the first place? Then just a couple of concluding points that I think both papers are touching on and do link in some ways to what we discussed a little bit earlier. The first is that both papers are thinking about the relationship between theory and practice, and trying to add political practice in interesting ways. But both are suggestive rather than do much work in terms of specifying what that relationship is. So is there something there that people think of interest, and if so, what is it? The second one is thinking again about the transnational not as a residue or as an excess, but actually thinking about it as constitutive in the first place, of ideas, of thoughts, of projects of world order making, of international politics itself. So again, how are these power-laden transnational circuits and flows and networks constitutive of thought and practice and politics, is a question that I'd like to open up.
Thank you very much. I can see twitching in the room.
That's the coffee.
Not necessarily, I mean, or Tarek, had a few softballs folded in the and or had a list of about 16 things which she's going to sort
talk
out
for the next hour.
So I'll leave all just for a moment while you think. But there, did you have a?
Yeah, if I can, sort of a comment and a question to Tarek and George. So first of all, pick up on your point, are you onto something or is it obvious? I think you're certainly onto something. It's also obvious. But Benedict Anderson was onto something that was obvious as well. So that's a good sign. I really like the idea that you put forward, and if I can draw on my own work on transnational war volunteers, I'm thinking about Che Guevara, for instance, right? So we have a practitioner who's clearly, deeply immersed in actual fighting, but also a theorist, and very important for our understanding of guerrilla warfare, etc. Would it be useful to think of it as a spectrum? That's my question. I mean, you whichever way you look at it, you have some people who are clearly and obviously theorists, quite useless academics like myself who sit down and write, but won't actually lift a finger to do anything practical. Then you have the hybrids, like Che Guevara, and again drawing on the research of George Orwell, the Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz, who are both practitioners and theorists. And then you have the pure soldiers, or the pure practitioners, people who really don't have any theoretical input. So I think that the spectrum here is quite a useful concept.
Sam.
Yes, I think to pick up on George's point too, or about boundaries. I think boundaries are crucial. And you ask about transnational boundaries, and I wanted just the very most obvious or usual definition of boundaries as political boundaries. I'm not sure what a national boundary is. And the case that I present to you as an Italianist, why doesn't anyone consider the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the early modern period as a nation state? Is it just anachronism that it doesn't fill up all of Italy? If you look at the boundaries, I can't think of what, and maybe this is my stupidity, I can't think of what the Grand Duchy doesn't have that the modern nation state has in terms of passports, in terms of enclosure, in terms of even these economic controls that are more sharp or more defining than the nation state. They're less porous. So is this just a matter of anachronism, or is there something fundamentally different? And how do we define boundaries? You know, what we all just assume we know. What is a national boundary?
It's okay, we'll add that to Or's list. I mean, we're generating traffic, which is good, and I wish to generate as much traffic. So we'll go to Piers and then Elizabeth.
Yes, very very quickly to Tarek and George to a certain extent, and it's kind of picking up the same point you're making about a spectrum, but I wondered whether part of what you're dealing with, it doesn't almost fit into a kind of chronological pattern. I would say that as a historian, wouldn't I? But so it strikes me that your best examples of the practitioner theorists are 19th century and earlier examples, and in a sense, as you get the emergence of the university world, you get more and more of the pure thinkers who wouldn't know what a gun was, even if they were handed one, and who write about war from a purely academic perspective. So isn't something changing over time, and does the nature of theory change as it moves from the practitioners to the academics?
Do you want to? I mean, sort of briefly.
I'll give I've thought a little bit about how we like the past, and I think there is something that the modern university does to the discourse of theory and practice that is really profound. I'm not sure I want to go all the way and say that contemporary practitioners aren't also doing this kind of thing. I think, for example, the ways in which the EU process in various ways has thrown up a set of concepts which travel between EU studies and EU diplomatic practice. One of the papers in George and I's special issue is about how in the third Geneva Conventions in the 1977 meetings, that when the Third World guerrilla leaders show up, they introduce and argue for a set of concepts that get added to the Geneva Conventions that come directly from their experiences of having fought imperial powers and wars of national liberation. So I think that there are a lot of ways in which the tracks are covered up about where some of these conceptual ideas come from. I think that the balance of power is very interesting. One of the things we don't really occur to us now is that Republican thinkers were very concerned with the balance of power. They didn't see it as something that only happened in the international system. They were concerned about the interaction between powers domestically and powers abroad that would be a threat to your liberty. Now we've kind of erased Republican statecraft as a source of theorization, and we imagine republicanism as a kind of theory of ideals floating up in the sky, not as the sort of operational concepts of early modern republics, of people like the people who were writing in the Federalist, to go a little bit beyond early modern, who are thinking about how it is we set up a new state, how it is that we're going to have international relations, how it is we're going to protect our liberty at home, and are throwing up all kinds of concepts that then get taken and looked at by political theorists. So part of the question that sort of, I can't work my way through yet, is what difference does it make to look at these ideas as having been generated in historical practice, rather than seeing them simply as intellectual systems? How do they begin to look different to us? And that, I think, is something that is a kind of cash out that we need.
Can I write one thing?
Yeah, we can. So I'm going to go Was that quick?
Oh, it's just something that came into my head when I was thinking about that, because the first thing that I thought about, because it's what I do, is the nuclear deterrence, the deterrence theorists of
totally.
Cold War, right, and Schelling and Brody and all those people. And I was just thinking, is there something in terms of kind of relating it to as well the idea of epochal change? I was just wondering, from my views, there's something specific about the nuclear actually.
And then they've retired to the universities and produced it as theory there.
So we'll carry this thought on via George, and then I'm going to get back to Elizabeth, who's and then Patricia, and then Pete.
One thing we could do in response to Piers' question is we could see when it changes, right, and how it changes. We could look at that particular relationship and then map that in some way. And I'm sure the story is about the rise of the modern university in some ways, but also about the rise of modern politics in some way. I mean, the interesting ... to the balance of power story is, of course, it then disappears as a tool of political mobilisation. You don't hear about balance of power anymore. You hear about a lot of other stuff. Maybe the pivot is about balance of power, or maybe other debates about polarity are about balance of power. But as a tool of political mobilisation, it effectively disappears.
It's coming back.
Right, well, maybe so. The new Cold War stuff, right? Maybe. But it's interesting that you could see how these stories could be interesting. So do we take an illustration like that and look at how it changes, or are there other ways of doing it? And the other thing is to pick up on the first question is different areas will be interesting. I mean, we cheat a bit with revolution because it's so cortically related to practice. It must be. And so, of course, different areas that we look at would look different. So how do we specify and differentiate the particular intervention we want to make that may be obvious and right, but how do we actually produce it? I think thinking about both the specific area you look at but also change over time is going to be crucial to seeing to what extent we're onto something.
So this is kind of just a really brief thought. I know we've been using the term boundary a lot, but increasingly the discussion is starting to sound like one that you normally find like at a Borderland Studies conference. And so I'm just wondering along those lines, I mean, Borderland Studies is not something that's really traditionally thought of in terms of international thought or theory, but I'm wondering if it's something that needs to be brought into this discussion, because in the way Borderlands are studied, like, and kind of in the discussion of boundaries, it's so frequently transnational, but also international negotiations or relations are so critical. So I think my suggestion or thought is just that we need to kind of broaden the way we're talking about theory and practice to kind of bring in some of these other disciplinary approaches.
For those of us who are not in Borderland Studies, could you just limit the mode of thought that you would, if you were sitting in a Borderland Studies?
Well, I'm just thinking, like, I mean, this is coming from very much a South Asian background, but thinking about scholars like James Scott, who's mentioned, or like William Van Schundel, and these ideas about how borderlands, or I guess if you wanted to use the term boundaries, how we think about these not only then as kind of potentially geopolitical spaces or geographical spaces, but also as these moments of interaction. And I think in that sense it's perhaps important to think about borders and boundaries as spaces to be intentionally crossed as well, and that aren't necessarily recognized. I agree with the idea that the boundary is an important thought, but I think it's also important to think about the ways that especially local actors or theorists also question these boundaries and try to overcome or rupture these boundaries as well.
And I think it's important to put this whole discussion of borderlands and boundaries in context. It's often presented as something entirely new. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading a book by Albert Sorel from the 1880s, where he talked about how we need to be a lot more sophisticated in how we think about borders and frontiers. For example, the Rhine has always been considered a natural frontier of France and a frontier, but in fact rivers are the opposite of frontiers. They're by definition, they're fluid and they're spaces that bring regions together.
Yeah, and they move.
Yeah, and this is 1885 from a fairly conservative French, kind of conservative Republican thinker that was anticipating so much of what I read now when I read the Borderlands Studies stuff. It's
yes, I suppose in that sense I'm wondering how, like, we talked a lot about boundaries today, but I guess to some point I'm kind of questioning how new an idea it is to read, and so I just think it's something we perhaps consider in broader schemes.
But my question to George and to Tarak is not really a question, but it's interesting also to think about the kind of the barriers to trying to move forward in your project, which are going to be methodological and fraught with academic politics as well. But methodological because, going into the archives and excavating this theory generation is not something that people who think of themselves as working in theory like to do or have any interest in doing at all. I mean, my old head of department, Ken Booth, used to say, we don't want to devote precious academic resources to archival burrowing.
Really?
Yeah. That's because he did archival burrowing, got bored with it, so he thought nobody else should do it either. But, and so that, it gets political, but, I mean, I think of, there's a really interesting character from the 1920s named Jacques Sédu, who many of us will be aware of, who was generating a whole bunch of ideas which linked political economy to power politics, and end up emerging, of all places, in legal theory as the closest thing I've been able to find to it, in what they call normative enmeshment. That is, you generate a situation where people have to interact in a certain way, and then these practices of interaction become normative, and then they become enmeshed in them, and that's how we're going to actually deal with Germany. He said that's the only way we're ever going to deal with Germany. And this translates in European integration in some ways, but the closest conceptualization I've seen of it is in legal theory. And it's really interesting, but I just happened on that by accident. You know, it's going to be an interesting enterprise to get people to cross, you know, to different sets of practices in order to try and think about different ways in which ideas emerge. Yeah, but this is just an observation. And academic politics are going to, I think, be a
boundary.
Boundary. Definitely trying to use that word. Barrier.
So was that you just pushing in front of Patricia, or was that a separate point from the original?
You're so self-centered. I didn't even see your hand up.
So when I say, you know, Patricia and Peter, you know, kind of, it's fine, you know.
Yeah.
But Patricia.
Thank you. It kind of fits on. It follows on very nicely, really, because I suppose, I mean, I think you're onto something, and the part of it was because whenever I was at conferences where people talk about the League of Nations, virtually every single internationalist thinker of the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and then 40s into the beginning of the UN is connected in some way with the League. So it's a kind of foundational moment in your discipline. Yeah. But also from the side of then coming across these IR thinkers as practitioners, it's very difficult when you're writing a history. Most of the stuff I've done is kind of practice-based, to connect them up to the intellectual history, because the intellectual history is all structured around this thinker relating to that thinker. So you have a completely different chronology, genealogy to those of us who work on practice. So I think that, so I don't know that you necessarily need to be archive burrowers on your own, but it's having that connection across to us, because we have certainly there were a bunch of us that had that problem from the other way around, and it's true. I mean, I had it in my own case with in economic history too, that actually the economists relate economists to one another's publications. They don't look at what they're doing as policy advisors, where they're key, and it's structured similarly. And so it's a big challenge to reconnect this in a way, the kind of some of the lost connections when history dropped out as a kind of methodological basis in economics or in IR, you know, and it became numerate. For me, that's where it, you know, that was lost. But I suppose the other thing I was thinking about, so Elizabeth's point about boundaries, and well, you described them as a moment of interaction or something. I suppose I was thinking about this from the perspective of crises, because it's kind of the points at which things become visible. So it's also, it might be another way of getting through the chronological issue. Hegel in Haiti is also, it's a kind of moment of crisis for Haiti, isn't it? So you can see all of these things at once, rather than do all of the boundaries shifting over time. You know, there's a kind of historians, how do I deal with all this bloody chronology? You know, and the economics, it's that, you know, it's kind of crisis as building capacity. So that's, I always find it a really helpful way of thinking about things.
It's becoming a book, not an article.
But it's okay, because luckily Peter and I are the only ones who go to the Alden, so we're the only ones who know that we always quote the same authors. That's a rare one. You quoted those last time. I'm going to use a same quote I've used, which is Francis.
No, I didn't.
I didn't know about
I
them.
probably told you about them before, but
Francis Bacon. Yeah, sort of spiders and ants and bees. The that kind of that triad exists. That's when I always trot out for that. But anyway, much more important second.
Not necessarily much more important, but I had a very general questions to at least the three presenters, if not to all of us. So I hope you forgive me the universalism of the question. But I was wondering, since we all know that there are so many different disciplines that engage very seriously with the generation of international theories and what they yield. What is the particular difference of the conversations if we are having this debate amongst historians? I would suspect that our approach, whatever implicit preferences we have, is different from the approaches taken by political scientists, by full-fledged IR theorists, by people who are working in the philosophy of history, social theorists, these all, even full-fledged borderlands people. And I was wondering whether it could be said that historians bring to the conversation an implicit preference for theories that have some kind of historical validity. For instance, Mao Zedong produced all kinds of international theories and theories of world order, while his own foreign relations policy was completely isolationist. And when a historian once gave a talk at Harvard about this, many of his colleagues were quite confused because they thought, well, these theories may have existed, but they were totally inaccurate. And I'm wondering whether, as historians, we are sort of pre-programmed in some way to consider only those theories and those theoretical arguments that have some resonance with historical experience. And if that preference exists, what we are going to do about it. I'm not sure whether that is too superficial and lofty of a question. I had a second very quick question for all, which is, have you any thoughts about boundary and war? Because there seems to be a significant political difference in the boundary that we set around ourselves, especially from a political, from a state perspective, and the boundaries that others set around us. I've been thinking about various historical crises, to take up Patricia Clevin's comment. The crisis of encirclement have a lot to do with boundary. Like you have Japan in the late 1930s claiming that they're encircled and their own yen bloc, which is their own effort to set boundaries around a transnational monetary union of sorts, that one has collapsed under American pressure. And therefore they're encircled by the ABCD powers, and they have no other way of breaking out of that encirclement than launching aggressive war all across Asia. Another example closer to the present is, of course, Russia, fearing encirclement by NATO, which is again the intrusion of boundaries that you can't control. The People's Republic of China nowadays in Southeast Asia claim that their Southeast Asian sphere of influence, by some other name, is encircled by the Americans most of all. And the only exception that comes to my mind is Switzerland. They're always encircled, but always peaceful at the same time. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
So that's like 26 question. I've been keeping all out of it, but I think I've bought you enough time. You can just say,
All right.
look, I've said my bit. I haven't got anything more to say to you, but you can.
I'll try to
talk back.
refer to some of the really interesting points that I got today. So I'll just start with Sept's point before I forget. definitely, I think that these examples that you've given are exactly relevant to what I'm trying to do here, and I'll get to that point in a minute. So I think these are kind of instances that produce the political spaces that I'm interested in. So this perception of being encircled and so on, this is all kind of translations of a geopolitical reality into a political idea. So the way you describe these instances is already imbued with the political categories that I'm interested in. So you kind of describe the results, and I'm interested in the way these outcomes are produced. So to go back a little bit to George's very interesting comments, yeah, that's great, because this is a totally work in progress. I was trying out on you various kinds of ideas to see what works better. And I think that the direction that I feel is the most prominent out of this kind of whole plethora of ideas that I've explored here is the one that focuses more on the kind of geographical experience. So kind of in tune with what Stefan said. The one that really explores as you said in the quote, Gali talks about the representation of space, but I think what I try to show here is that representation of space depends on an experience, which is spatial in a concrete term, so geographical. So I think this is the most interesting direction that I could go with. And I agree with you that some of the boundaries that I drew here are more conceptual and a bit more, let's say, metaphorical than others. But I still think that there is kind of a spatial dimension that kind of represents the more interesting bit of this exploration for me, and perhaps I'll take it further in the kind of final version. As for the epochal change, yes, I agree with you that this is kind of a, well, it's an intentional concept that's also kind of hidden there in the vast amount of ideas that I've tried to explore. But I think that the epochal change was caused by this kind of spatial developments. I don't really have time to go into that now, but well, whether it's very different now, the kind of political conceptions that we have, whether they're very different from the ones they had in the 19th century, that's debatable. But I think the perceptions of the space are different. Okay, what is a transnational boundary? That's a good question, but I think that that kind of brings us back to the point made here, which I explored in much more detail in my paper than in the presentation, which sees boundary as a zone of encounter rather than as a kind of a line of division. So I think if we can think of transnational boundaries in this, in an interesting term, it might be that kind of direction that more emphasizes more encounter than division and difference. But yeah, that could be further developed. Well, the most difficult question, I think, is really about the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And I think I'll have to raise a white flag here.
Right, let's pursue Tuscany, Peter.
Well, I do have a question, and I hope it's not too naive. But how do you recognize a political space when you see it? In other words, for me, but I think it's maybe because I have a very limited idea of what I mean by that concept. Personally, it's where possibilities open up. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the reason you're looking at, especially a new political space, is its content. And you haven't said much about that. And I'm not saying you should, but I'm wondering if you think it might be a useful and interesting way to, in other words, it's the content of the spaces which make them worth being interested in. And part of that content always has to be new possibility. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, I agree about the content. I'm not sure about the kind of novelty, whether political space has to have this kind of content of new possibilities. I think what matters really for me in political space is I think it's a useful way of thinking about where politics happens, where kind of international relations happen. So to give it a more kind of concrete, down-to-earth, practical interpretation. So even if we go back to the first paper that we've heard, I think that the kind of practices of doing international relations and the kind of concrete spaces that they create are important in understanding the theory. So the political space is kind of the interaction between these kind of very clear, let's think of transnational federation that people wrote about extensively in the 1940s. So visions of a federation, you can think of that as a political space, and then, but it's not like neutral. It's kind of the result of a reflection that revolves around a geographical experience, but has also kind of very concrete political content. So I'm trying to explore these kind of tensions between the geography and the politics and the way that they develop in international relations. But I feel like I need to maybe get more content in so I can make it clearer for those who maybe are not kind of working with these ideas.
Can I have a follow-up, sir?
You most certainly can.
In that, I think that's great, but then I don't think Galley's the way in. I wouldn't have thought, because that's not what he's interested in. Is he? He's more interested in the representations, but not so interested in the geography. I mean, if you were to start with the geography, it strikes me that there are at least a couple of choices that might be more interesting. I mean, one is geopolitics itself, which you have a long-standing interest in, and this sort of return to geopolitics and the actual existing fusion of geography and politics and where that went and why and where it is today. And the second one is the really interesting work on spaces of capitalism. I mean, Ferguson, looking at Lesotho and looking at how capital dots around, that's a political space. James Scott was a really good idea there. And all the really interesting political geographers, Swingadoo and Brenner and Harvey and all those characters, the space, I mean, that's all about spatialisation and geography and political order making and all the rest of it. But the third one is about logistics. I mean, this is, when I showed my students this is, people probably can't see this, but this is real active shipping that goes on in the world. Looking at the logistics, looking at ports as political spaces. Or there's another one that I always show them when they get too stuck up on sovereignty, about a great sample of geopolitical anomalies. These are all the different forms of sovereignty that exist in the contemporary world. So, those are all ways in that exist and are really interesting. And I think the project is fascinating in that regard, but doesn't it then require a different point of origin?
Well, I kind of disagree with the things that Galley's work can do. I don't find... I think that what he's useful for is to take the kind of geopolitical writings that I've seen that I know elsewhere, towards a dimension that speaks better to the history of international thought and theory in that sense. So I think that the kind of geographical dimension of his writings is not only in terms of representation, it's not merely kind of mediated. There is also an attention to the actual geography. I couldn't perhaps present that in detail here, but it definitely exists. So it's not merely, I think it does speak to the same concerns that a lot of the literature in geopolitics does today, but in a way that offers me a more immediate path to the conceptual and theoretical things that I'm interested in kind of the history of international thought, rather than in kind of, geopolitics, which has different, let's say, research questions. So Galley's already paved a kind of connection between these concerns, I think, to the more of history of thought concerns. Right. So that's why I think it's interesting.
Okay. I have a question for Tarek and George. It was a throwaway remark, but you said you were working on this and you'd thrown it out there, and you found the responses disappointing. Yeah, you don't need to name names or anything.
Oh, we can do that if you like.
But what did you want? And what were they, and why were they where's the source of your disappointment?
I think my one-line answer to that is they were too creative, and not focused enough on our call.
Right.
I think they took it in directions. There's a one-page version that we used as the call, and it generated quite a lot of interest. People were like, oh, we really want to do that. But then when we actually saw the papers, it didn't seem to do what it is. They were not sort of studies of moments of historical theory generation and practice.
Right. So
I
what
don't
were
know
they?
what George would
Yeah, what was it that people wanted?
Huge variety.
a
of things.
huge variety.
Some did sort of history of ideas,
Yes.
which is it's already there.
Yeah.
It's a different form that we want to get to. And actually, one of the things we tried to set up is we don't mean Cambridge School stuff. We mean something different. We really don't mean history
Yeah.
of ideas. But that didn't go anywhere.
We're not doing Skinner Redux. Yeah. So
Someone's a bit disciplined.
Some of the ones that were closer to was the one I described about the Third Geneva Convention.
Yeah.
Another one took Hannah Arendt and put her in the context of the international relations of the 30s and 40s,
Right.
and recovered some of her own political practice. And writings that were not, the ones that become famous, and that
Didn't always do the links though, right? We often had to
Didn't
write back and say,
actually make
you've
the links.
said this, but
Yeah.
you haven't made the links. We're really interested in the links. That's what
Exactly.
people leave behind. They give you context, they give you ideas, but what we wanted to say is this isn't a magic trick, right? We want
Yeah.
to see what these links actually
Yeah.
are. And that we
and
found
that
people
didn't-
struggling
that
to
didn't
do.
get picked. That didn't get
Right.
picked up on. I think is the
Good for us because now we can do it.
It's like I was listening a little bit to some of the discussion earlier. If you think of a character like Frantz Fanon, who has a big role in contemporary theory, which works almost in complete separation from his biographically determined situation. And one of the things that entirely disappears in the theoretic reception of Fanon is the fact he was a practicing psychiatrist who was doing really interesting things with people traumatized by the Algerian War and was developing all these sort of modes of therapy that have just sort of disappeared. In the theoretical literature, he appears as some major FLN figure instead of a sort of minor propagandist and latterly diplomat that he in fact was. And I'm sort of interested in putting these two things together. What is Fanon's situation that shapes and determines the kinds of theoretic stuff that he does? And people didn't do that. They stayed in their boxes.
How far back do you go in your...
This is an idea piece, so we're not.
I think the earliest
we're not
one is about Alfred Marshall, the sort of turn of the century.
I can think of some really interesting work going on in the 16th and 17th and 18th century.
Oh no, yeah, there's one paper
On the
Age
balance of power, for example.
Yeah, well, there's one actually paper on the Age of Revolutions, which is
We've
very
got-
good by a historian.
A real expert in the room on that period and those
Right.
thinkers, which we should take advantage of at some point.
But I think that I hadn't really thought about it in this way. It's taken me a while to think about it. But I mean, there's partly just the boring answer that academics are stuck in there. So they find a convenient thing and they produce the same thing with a little top and tail that's different. I mean, that's standard, right? But the more interesting thing about why is that, and I think people fell onto familiar tropes. One was biography. So if we're interested in Fanon the psychiatrist, then we get into just a sort of biographical rendering of what that was, and we would probably then struggle to say, okay, what's the politics of that? What did that mean for his projects of world order making and disruption and revolution and so on? So that was one side. The other side is people stayed very much in the history of ideas, mode and mentality, and didn't then connect it up to materiality and politics and that kind of thing. Or they just simply went context stuff and didn't provide the link. So the familiar tropes were apparent. People liked the idea and they think about them, but they didn't do quite the type of cortical interrelating that we were really interested in.
Right. I mean, to go back to the specifics, and you are say, are fields different? Sort of are there?
Yeah.
It's not all. It's not everything.
Yeah.
And so, do you think is it a particularly a military one that that is? Because I mean, the obvious, sort of banal, up to date one is Betrayus, isn't it? And the sort of kind of colonels without orders, or whatever they call themselves. And you chose Klaus. I just wonder if that's actually excluding the military, although it pains me to say it.
Yeah.
It might pain you as well.
If it's actually...
If it's different.
It's exclusive too.
Exclusive
Oh, I see.
than some of the others. That some of the others are tougher. to make the case
Yeah, I
for?
think the economists
Yeah.
fit in here pretty well, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they've covered up their tracks.
Yeah,
As
yeah,
I was very
really,
interested in-
no. They have been very good,
Yeah.
and they're not, and economists don't study that.
Yeah.
You know, they've stopped studying it, and even people, somebody as famous as Keynes. Actually, when you look at work on his policy advice, it's very limited.
It's very thin, yeah. So he
Very-
shows up as a thinker,
Yeah.
not as a
fascinating.
policymaker.
Yeah, it's
Although Keynes is also surely relevant, Patricia, to your point about the sort of the way in which numbers and everything else takes over from the politics.
Yeah, and he
if you-
talks about
because I go back and look at economists like Keynes, and sort of the depth of political connection he had was very different from many of the economists more
And
recently.
I think like the point you were making, that once these theoretic systems get out there and then are subject to further intellectual rationalization, they do become something that only intellectuals can handle.
Yeah.
that's right.
But then you interpret them in ways. So the Clausewitz stuff, I think, is really interesting. If you think about the Trinity as, or one of the primary Trinity or the secondary Trinity, let's not get into the specifics of this, as a theory of war, versus as a political statement he was trying to make in a context where they're trying to get military decision making away from the king and the aristocracy and towards the professional soldiers, so that what looks like a theory is in fact a political argument. It's a political tool meant to achieve certain things in the context that he was actually operating in.
Right.
But we then read it as a theory. How do we, if we look at it in context of what the Prussian military reformers were trying to do, and how that politics shaped what we understand as a general objective theory, how do we then begin to see that theory different and its generation different? I think those are some of the kinds of questions one would open up, and I can't get out of the military side of it. It's just what I know,
But it isn't just that, right? I think The Economist is a really good point. And I like your
Freud
point.
is another one.
Yeah, but the moment of visibility that stems from crisis is a really good way of putting it that we might latch onto, and the way that it becomes the politics of numbers, and that then segments a particular type of population that's then able to read them as a professionalization story is a really good illustration of what we're talking about. I mean, I start my IR theory course on Monday. We're thinking about three international theorists of that period, right? Mackinder, Wolff, and Du Bois. With the point that Mackinder is not just a theorist of geopolitics. If you think of him as just a theorist, you read that abstractly, you're going to miss what this was actually about. Same with Wolff, same with Du Bois. They were actively participating, and the theories were meant to mobilise people to do stuff. And I try then to get the students out of the mindset of thinking that there's the professional academy, here's politics. They're separate spheres, and so trying to get it doesn't work because they're stuck, and then they have that for a week and they think, what's this about? And then they write, I didn't really like that lecture, whatever. It's getting too private now. So that's what we're trying to get at. What was it, and then how did it separate, and then to reappear in this very thin way of kind of policy relevance that we have today.
What about a context where military practitioners are looking back at the work and writings of early, like Guerre Révolutionnaire? The whole theory of Guerre Révolutionnaire is soldiers in the Algerian War, looking back to Lyoté and some of the thinkers from the late 19th century, and trying to draw for practice at the time, which then becomes
Theorized.
Yeah,
Which then informs
yeah.
Petraeus in various ways.
Yeah, I mean, Kalula, kind of they're yeah, I mean, perhaps I could ask the same question, but in the other way. Okay, is there anywhere this doesn't apply? Sort of, I was it might just apply to the military and the other, but, are there any fields that you can think of where your trinity of this really quite fat interaction doesn't work?
But it would maybe not, but it would apply differently. I mean, there are places where it's obviously close to social work. I mean, various forms of housing policy. I mean, so there's somewhere it's going to be far more obvious. I actually think in some ways we're starting at the harder end because people imagine that this doesn't have the type of connection and international thought that we might think. So I would have thought it's probably, if it's a spectrum, it's probably got harder, stickier forms and closer forms in some of those type of subjects that it does. I mean, I don't know how it's going to work in English literature, but Said and other stuff, you can imagine that there would be a story to tell there about comparative literature and how that has this type of relationship. So I would imagine that it's almost always there, if not always there, but the form it takes is clearly quite different. And will have a different chronology, probably.
Yeah. So it is a grand theory of everything.
It's a grounding of everything. It's becoming that.
And are we talking? Is the argument that people who combine the Trinity are the privileged? That essentially, that's where we must look, because when you see those three things together, you're getting near the heart of darkness. And whichever whether it's
you're right
social
to press us on this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Sort of, or are they outliers? You could say, we could find that in any field, but they're outliers. They're unusual.
For me, we have to show what difference it makes to look at these familiar characters this way, as opposed to the other way.
Yes.
But I thought you had a hand up. I want to steal.
Sorry, I got too interested. Sorry, I will.
No, not at all, Simon. It really follows on from what Simon was saying, which is that if you push it as far as you might be inclined to, do you in fact simply undermine theory completely and argue its remembered experience? And that will take you into the academic politics big time, because what's so attractive about what you're doing from a historian's point of view is that nobody can now write about theory and history without citing Skinner or Pocock or all the other gods.
Right.
And even if it is notorious among historians that Skinner has never produced a book proving his own methodology.
Well, you
works.
can't. You can't.
This isn't being
Skinner can't do
recorded,
Skinner.
is it? And therefore we've got ourselves into a terrible bind. And your approach offers a way forward, but I just wonder how far you want to push it.
Yeah,
it's a great question.
Yeah.
We certainly want to contest, demolish the notion of theories as these kind of perfect abstract systems of thought that can appear from nowhere and have no particular content, historical, political, and that we treat them as these abstract formulations that are unproblematically applicable to various times and places. That is our starting point. How far that is pushed is a really interesting
we have
question.
not worked out.
No, although we keep on saying we need to look at that as a starting point.
I mean, it occurs to me, to give one particular example, Immanuel Kant is going to be a very major problem for you, because his context is wandering down to the University of Königsberg, giving a lecture, going back home and thinking. And, now that doesn't mean, I mean, in one sense it's a different kind of theory. It qualifies, but it doesn't overturn.
Although, when you think about the services of veterans to philosophy, starting with Socrates, it's quite large. Descartes and his PTSD staring in the fire. Unfold all of the characters who were first soldiers and then philosophers.
I was fired at, therefore I am.
But I think the point works best as a really sort of way of busting up the particular categories through which we've studied these things.
Yes, exactly.
And putting back together things that I think need to be put back together. How we go about making that argument, and of course the problem is all of us face in these kinds of settings, you have to ultimately get published in what usually is a disciplinary place. And that limits and shapes the way that
as you know, this will be there is another stage beyond talking, where we will have an opportunity to publish stuff in this space, and so we'll be relying
It's a
on
space
you.
of possibility.
Probably sounds better in French, that. Note to self. Okay. I'm going to look round. I don't want to cut anyone off who wants to make a contribution. Is that? Did I see a bid? Did I ground theory and everything?
it's silent back here, but
It's okay. We managed to take the fire off you in the end, and that was great. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, thank you.
Clausewitz described as a subaltern. That's a new.
I know.
That's a new way forward as well.
yeah, that's Shane Brighton's. That's another co-author of mine.
Right.
Yeah. But the minute you say it, he is.
Yeah, makes sense. But you do see with the people